Welcome, everyone. This is Pat Bailey, Director of Training at Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. We welcome you to our 2017 Town Call Series in January. We're going to talk about what's next, stepping into 2017 and LGBTQ workplace equality. This is a broadcast audio call, and you should be hearing us through your computer, so make sure your speakers and headsets are turned up so you can hear. You can also use the chat box on the left-hand side to respond to questions and put in your comments. We'll also have a couple of polls here in a couple of minutes. To respond to those, click on the answer on the screen and hit submit, and we'll be able to see the tallies on that. If you have trouble signing in, here's the information, and this session will be recorded and available after the series ends. To kick off our series this year, we have a special message from our CEO, Celeste Berry.
Well, Happy New Year, and welcome to the Out and Equal University monthly Town Call Series. We work every day to create workplaces where we can bring all of who we are to work, and we can truly be out and equal at work. We want all employees to have the freedom to be out as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and out as allies. And we want you to have the resources you need to make real change in your workplace. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of Out and Equal, and thank you for joining this important town call.
Thanks, Celeste. And we've got a few announcements of things coming up. We do have a lot more of our virtual summit series. You were watching before the call started some highlights from our 2016 summit. We picked some of the best of those workshops that occurred. And our next one coming up on January 31st is Engaging Middle Managers in Driving LGBT Equality. And you can see the other topics there on February 7th, 14th, and 28th. We're going to come back on February 23rd with our monthly town call looking at LGBT generations. And then we have our executive forum coming up. If you're not familiar with that, it gives an opportunity for out LGBT and allies being able to come together and being able to talk about what the next steps are at the executive or the emerging leader sessions. And then we have a gala on the 29th to finish that weekend here in San Francisco. And also don't forget the summit on that. I'm going to give our presenters an opportunity real quickly to introduce themselves with their name and their title. So Laura, why don't you start that off?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Pat. My name is Laura Durso, and I am the Vice President of the LGBT Research and Communications Project at the Center for American Progress. We're a DC-based, nonpartisan, progressive think tank dedicated to data-driven public policy.
Hello, and I'm Janet Boyd. I'm the Director of Government Relations and Legislative Counsel for the Dow Chemical Company.
And Jean, I think you might still be on mute.
And good afternoon. I'm Jean Goldberg. I'm a Senior Attorney Advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel at the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Great. And we'll be chatting out all their bios as they present during the call. But I want to ask a couple of poll questions. And first off, we know that it's a brand new year, and all your companies and corporations and organizations are looking for training materials, and so we have a poll here. If you have a hard time reading that, go ahead and enlarge the screen to full size. And so go ahead and select the topics that you and your company might be looking at working with this year. We have about 213 participants on the call, so I'll keep a check, and you can hit submit or skip to the results, and you'll be able to see. It looks like unconscious bias and developing ally programs are running high, as well as basic LGBT. I get some comments coming in looking for starting an ally program, and so that's great. And we'll give a little bit more time. A little over half the audience has responded so far. And again, our sessions today will be recorded, and you'll be able to download and use them. You'll get a follow-up email on that. So it looks like highest level, developing ally programs and unconscious bias. Thank you for your input on that. And let's go ahead and get some more specific information on this call. So what's your business sector? What area are you working in? And go ahead and click the area and where you fit on that and hit submit on the results. And it looks like, again, we've got everybody's back and responding quickly here. We've got about 35% in banking and insurance. We've got some others chatting in. We've got packaging, agriculture, insurance, I saw some other topics come in terms of training about self-identification, technology, medtech, high-tech, IT. Great. We've got about 2/3 commercial real estate, wine and spirits, transportation. Great. Let's talk now and take a look at what your role within your company is. What's your position and what's your job in that organization? And get a chance to see who's on the call. And again, we see, again, chat in if it doesn't apply. We've got project managers. Looks like overall we've got about 62% are LGBT employees. And of that group, ERG, BRG leaders are members. And we've got some allies on the phone, so thank you for joining us as well. And then our last question, kind of building in this series, is your opinion. And this is an opinion poll, agree or disagree. I don't think that LGBT workplace protections and benefits will change much during the next administration. So you can click your answer there and submit your results. And we can see that right now we've got about 43% strongly disagree, 29% disagree. And we've got a good mix on that there. Almost everybody's checked in on that. Well, and that's why we have the call today, because we're going to see, what some of our experts are thinking about and what their perspectives are for moving into 2017. So I'm going to turn this over to Laura and go ahead and let her start from her perspective for Center for American Progress.
Thanks so much, Pat, and thank you all for joining us today. Excited to get into a number of different issues with you with a particular focus on workplace equality. But as you might imagine, in this moment in time, I think we're all responding to a lot of information that is coming through the TV and social media. And so I think it is important to just start off noting that since LGBT people are found in every community, really all of these debates that we're having at this moment in time are LGBT equality issues, and so I'm excited to get into more of these things with you. I think to talk about where we are in this moment in time, it's important to remember where we've been, and so I'd like to start out actually with some key highlights from 2016 to remind us of a few achievements really from last year. So in the spring of last year, you may recall that the Department of Health and Human Services finalized what are called regulations to advance non-discrimination in healthcare. And what was really key about that was that they advanced LGBT inclusive protections. And so as of this moment in time, the Affordable Care Act protects LGBT people in health insurance coverage. You may have heard about a lawsuit. We can get into that a little bit later today. But this is really actually the best time to get covered if you're an LGBT person, particularly if you're a transgender person, because plans had gotten ready for the 2017 enrollment period, and many have removed things like exclusions for transition-related care. And so there are really key protections that are seen in the marketplace right now. So just want to put in a plug that you can still search for new coverage options and enroll in new coverage for 2017. So that was a major achievement from last year. We also saw new protections out of the Department of Housing and Urban Development that was really responding to particularly startling statistics on discrimination that occurs in things like emergency shelters for folks who are experiencing homelessness. The picture on the left there is actually from a study that we had conducted with the Equal Rights Center that found that among transgender women trying to access emergency shelter, only 30% of those shelters would appropriately house those transgender women with other women. These were real-life calls that were made to assess whether these women could access the shelters, and basically we found that they were turned away or told that actually they would be housed either in isolation or inappropriately with men. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development set out new rules in September that address the types of mistreatment that people experience in these settings. Of course, there were some pretty high-profile things that you may have seen. These were coming out of the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. The federal government took a very strong stance last year against anti-trans discrimination and laws like North Carolina's House Bill 2. And looking ahead in 2017, obviously we have this new administration, and so we want to be monitoring for what kinds of positions this administration will take on whether things like the Civil Rights Act and Title IX covers protections for transgender students. Before I get a little bit into this new administration, I actually want to quickly turn to what we're looking at in Congress right now, and really at a debate that's happening as we speak in the coming weeks here. As I said earlier, the Affordable Care Act does provide new non-discrimination protections for LGBT people, which is important. But it also actually, there's evidence that it's making a significant dent in the ability of LGBT people to access coverage. The graph that you see here compares 2 years of data, the year prior to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and the year after, and looks at changes over time in the uninsurance rates among low and middle income LGBT people and those in the general population. And you can see here that the Affordable Care Act really has made a significant dent in the uninsurance rate for both groups, but LGBT people are still lagging behind. So when we talk about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, it's important to note that the repeal efforts are in fact targeting what LGBT people need in order to get good coverage and care. Things like the availability of marketplace plans, subsidies that make health insurance more affordable, and the expansion of Medicaid for people with disabilities and those with low incomes, where we actually see the uninsurance rate falling faster when you expand Medicaid as opposed to states that have not. So let's transition a little bit and talk about the new administration. Obviously around healthcare, we are monitoring for efforts to either eliminate or undermine the non-discrimination protections under the Affordable Care Act, either through a lack of enforcement or through a new rule. So I mentioned that there's a lawsuit out of the state of Texas and with other states who are suing to block the implementation of this Section 1557, the non-discrimination protections. And we're monitoring that closely. With a new Attorney General, the Department of Justice could choose not to defend that lawsuit, and we would see changes in the ways that they are enforcing protections, and we may in fact lose that kind of protection. Without those non-discrimination protections, we really could go back to a time when transgender people were denied medically necessary care, when people with HIV could be barred from having coverage because of having pre-existing conditions, or when same-sex spouses couldn't get the same benefits that different sex couples had. And so we really do want to watch this very, very closely. Similarly, there are challenges to guidance out of the Department of Justice and the Department of Education protecting all students from discrimination based on gender identity under Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Here again, we want to be watching for what position the administration takes on whether transgender students are protected in their classrooms. We are already seeing changes to immigration policy that unfortunately may result in families with LGBT people, with same-sex couples being separated, spouses being denied entry into the United States, and even those seeking refuge from persecution abroad really being left without hope. There are a number of changes made under the Obama administration to make our immigration programs more equitable for LGBT people, and we could see some of those slings sliding backwards. This includes things like, there's around 250,000 LGBT people who are undocumented, and actually evidence suggests that 10% of people who are registered for what's called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or DACA, 10% of those recipients are LGBT. And as you may have seen, the President has indicated that he will end that program, opening people up to the risk of deportation. And in workplace equality, digging in a little bit there, we are obviously keeping a close watch on any changes to an executive order issued by President Obama in 2014 banning discrimination against LGBT people in federal contracting. Now, this is important because federal contractors actually make up around a fifth of the nationwide workforce. Around 28 million people receive protections under this executive order. So changes to it could really have a negative impact. And that's because we know that discrimination in the workplace is still sadly a reality for many LGBT people. There's additional research. I have a few numbers up on the screen here. 1 in 10 LGB workers has said they've been discriminated against in the past 5 years. This includes things like not being hired, fired, or promoted. Recent data out of the National Center for Transgender Equality shows that 27% of transgender workers say the same, and that's within the past year. And even when they're equally qualified, have the exact same resumes, LGBT applicants are less likely to get job interviews or offers than their peers. It's important to note that the President may not rescind the executive order outright. There are ways in which if you inserted what's called a religious exemption, that might undermine the effectiveness of that executive order. And there's a picture here of a couple, John and Jerry, who we talked with last year, who were impacted by this type of discrimination when John was fired from his job as the executive director of a senior living facility that was Catholic-owned. And he is currently fighting that dismissal as we speak. And finally, I'd just like to talk about and make a note of the fact that changes in federal policy are particularly challenging given the patchwork of state and local protections that exist currently. You'll see a map here on the screen of the only 20 states that have explicit employment protections for all LGBT people. This means on the basis of both sexual orientation and gender identity. It's certainly true that LGBT people deserve the same layers of protection afforded to others, and residents of states without protections are left particularly unprotected if changes to federal policy occur. So much like in 2016, we do expect that there is going to be another round of anti-LGBT legislation introduced across the country, so advocates are going to be defending their rights on multiple fronts. Now, I've thrown a ton of information at you, and we're going to do questions at the end, but I did want to close in just saying that we are here as a resource. We provide a number of different research products and ideas for people, not just in the private sector, but governments as well. And so please feel free to reach out, follow us on Twitter, find us on the web, and happy to answer questions at the end as we go. So next, it is my pleasure to introduce Janet Boyd again, who will be talking about some of the initiatives that the Dow Chemical Company has been undertaking.
Thank you, Laura. And you actually set up my talk very well, in ending with a discussion about all the activity that will be going on in the state legislatures this year. And that is an area where the employer community has been engaged in the past and will continue to be engaged in 2017. So what I thought I would do, and here's an agenda that I was going to work through, is to give you a little bit of an idea of who we are so you can get an idea of why we are engaged the way we are. I'll talk a little bit about the anti-LGBT bills in which we are currently engaged and which we have been engaged in the past few years. A little bit more on Dow's approach, just a touch on national legislation. Obviously, it would be great to have national legislation so we wouldn't have to worry about all the various state initiatives. And then a little bit more on looking ahead to 2017. Obviously, we're just in the first few weeks, but I think we can get an idea of what to expect in the future. So this is Dow. You know, we are a good Midwest company, which might be somewhat unusual to be so out front and comfortable with advocating publicly in favor of positive legislation, both at the state and national levels. We have a number of employees throughout the United States in a number of different states, so the importance of having a uniform rule or at least some consistency across the United States is very important to us. So what I wanted to do is start a little bit with what got us into this positioning originally. And I think probably many of you will probably be familiar with this short history that I give to you, but it bears worth remembering how and why employers are engaged in this space. And it pretty much started, at least with a great intensity, out in Indiana, believe it or not. So Indiana had a RFRA bill in 2015. It was signed, and that started a great deal of consternation by businesses. And they realized at that point that it would become a real problem for us in being able to keep good employee, and we do have operations in Indiana, good employee populations if the states were being deemed and understood as being discriminatory. So that is the reason why that is probably the beginning of most businesses' engagement in this space. And interestingly, the social media, as it became more and more useful in getting news information out, was also very helpful back in 2015 in getting the business community engaged on this. This was when Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff went on Twitter and said, this is something that we just cannot tolerate. And this was brought to the attention of a number of companies, and with that, it led to the development of a business coalition that became very public and put out a lot of ads. And those ads went to the attention of my CEO and the other leaders in my company, and it became very clear that we were going to have to engage in this space. And then when you add to that, in the same year, you had the Supreme Court ruling, which was quite positive, but quite frankly led to a lot of consternation, and particularly in some of the more conservative states. And then particular to Dow's interest, because we do have large operations in and around Houston, there was a vote on overturning the city's protection back in 2015 as well. So this was the first place where our executives became very clear that they were going to have to be engaged at their level, and that to leave it at lower levels was not going to be very effective. I'm going to quickly go through these. Were just horrendous ads that were used in the Houston Hero effort, and when you see things like this, you know very well that it's critical for employers to be engaged on that. So the head of Dow's Gulf Coast operations did an op-ed in Houston, and we were hoping that by, again, getting enough people engaged, and we definitely got our own individual employees engaged in this process, that we would be successful. But many of you know, that vote was lost, and but this encouraged us and actually gave us the tools that we're going to be using in 2017 to move forward on this. So I wanted to just make sure to remind everyone what the various states, what kind of LGBT bills that we find in various states. And you can pretty much categorize the negative ones into 4 different categories. And the first would be anti-transgender. The second relates to marriage. The third is the RFRA, or religious refusal bills. And somewhat related would be the First Amendment Defense Act, FADA bills. And then finally, the municipal preemption. In many cases, the bills at the state level will include a number of maybe more than one of these items all mixed up together into one. And that makes it all the more onerous, obviously, in the end. So the marriage bills, we have 3 general kinds of marriage bills, and they usually relate to what kind of services that can be or would have to be provided, or would not anymore be provided to LGBT couples. And so this would be the cake baker, you don't have to make cakes, pastor protection, and then marriage licensing. The next set of the bills is what we call the religious refusal bills. So if you have a religious a conviction against the LGBT community, you wouldn't have to provide services for them. And then in the last slide I have with regard to the FADA, which is similar but a little bit different. It does, goes into the same sort of thing to protect. Now, the FADA sort of structure is what's being used, unfortunately, in a negative bill, at least in the past at the federal level. To date, that bill has not been reintroduced, but one would anticipate that it will be. So all these bills, and then guess what? Finally, I wanted to talk about was sort of the municipal protection. That was really what came out of the North Carolina bill and is now being used. It was used or could have been used in Texas against the Houston if the Houston vote had turned out differently. So, as I put here, approximately 34 million people nationwide have more comprehensive non-discriminatory protections from local law than they do from state law. So it becomes critical for us to protect the ability for municipalities to continue to move in this direction with the thinking that as more municipal governments become aggressive, it will bleed into what happens at the state level. Obviously, some of the states get concerned, like it was in North Carolina, and they try to push back. So I think a lot of you have probably thought this through in your various companies, but Dow really sets the business case using basically 4 different ways of looking at it. And the first is, if you have a negative impact on state reputation, it won't be a good place for you to have your operations. As I was mentioning at the front end, Dow is a manufacturer. When we build our operations, they are generally very large, very expensive facilities, and so we're not going to be interested in investing in a state that becomes very negative. It isn't good for our operations, and it definitely isn't good for our employees. And that goes to the second imperative, which is the talent imperative. We find that individuals want to work in locations in which they are open, and even as we keep our own facilities open and non-discriminatory, it becomes imperative that those areas outside of our fences are just as opening as we have inside our fences. And then the third would be the chilling effect on investors and tourism. And then finally, our internal and external stakeholders, not only our employees but our customers, they want us to have the right corporate values. And so by being public and out in the open with regard to our positioning, with regard to negative legislation, make sure we are aligned with how we perceive our stakeholders and what they really want us to do. So in short, we've been involved in order to have attract new employees and retain employees. Our sites are generally in rural or in conservative areas, and this presents a challenge to us, but we've been able to manage that. Third, we are a multinational company, so we're used to having a lot of different ideas coming from our employee population, and this is just a reflection of who we are. And then finally, it's important for us to have this external recognition and validation of our policies. So just real quickly, I'm sure many of you have stories that are very similar to this. Our ERG is called GLAD. We have a lot of both LGBT individuals as well as allies. We're located in 89 different places in which we do have facilities, and including that, there's about 30 countries, and that is the place that we're really trying to expand. Here's a bit of a history. I suspect many of you have similar histories. We started way back in 1999, starting with a non-discrimination policy, and from there we moved through an out process ourselves, in which it involved quite a number of efforts to engage the various our executives, as well as then it moved to actually engaging on the national level as well as the state level to get legislation correct. So this is our history, and we're quite proud of it. We actually testified on Capitol Hill a number of times, as listed here, starting back in 2008 when we testified in favor of our transgender policies. And then the most recent time was in 2012. Hopefully we'll have additional opportunities to work with Capitol Hill coming up in 2017. That's what we're hoping for. Obviously, it's a new environment than we had back in the previous administration. So we also work with a number of different organizations, including Out and Equal. I sort of put out the logos of 3 different organizations that you might not think about. In the past, the benefits have been very important to equalize those amongst the LGBT community and the ally community, and it was important to work with some organizations like the American Benefits Council to get legislation to be positive in that space. And then I point out the log cabin Republicans. They're going to be important for us in this 2017. They've gotten involved in not only in the political side but also in policy issues, and I think that they could be important to us. Then 2015, there's some items there that we worked on. 2016, similar to there. But I want to sort of skip through the rest of these a little bit quickly because this just sort of evidences sort of the efforts that we were doing before, because I really want to make sure that we focus or I have a chance to talk about where are we now and what can we do. Now, first thing is 2017 could be an area where we might be able to see some movements on the anti-discrimination bill that is being worked on by the LGBT community. It covers all these items. I think it's going to be very difficult to get that through with Republicans in both the House and Senate, and also with the president. But that being said, it doesn't mean we can't work on it, and that's what we will do. There's been some support by the business community on that, and that will continue to grow and be important. And this is a list that HRC put together on that. So here is what we're going to be doing in 2017. We're going to have to learn how to work with this new administration. So far, the efforts that have come from the new president have not been particularly helpful. It hasn't been in the bullseye of the LGBT community, but it's still early to tell. So we're going to have to learn how to work with them. We worry that negative action could be centered as much on Congress as it is with the new administration. Even if President Trump doesn't attack, I worry that the Congress will take some initiative to do so. And then we're going to be working, and primarily are working on Texas right now. Texas is a problem. We've got a bill that's been introduced, and this is going to be problematic. We already talked in the last session about the Title IX risks, and then one of the concerns is now that we're going to have opportunities for President Trump to name new Supreme Court nominees. Will that have an impact on same-sex marriage? I don't think it's going to happen much at the front end, but it is something that we have to watch carefully, particularly if additional justices, for whatever reason, are having to be replaced. And then finally, I want to just point out that we're working in the international space. I think that's an important thing for a lot of companies to do, and I think we're going to see more and more companies doing that as well. So with that, I apologize for having to sort of rush toward the end. I wanted to say so many things and I only had a bit of time to do it. But with that, I want to hand it over to Jean Goldberg. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Janet. Laura spoke to start us off from the advocate perspective, and Janet spoke from an employer's perspective on employer engagement, on non-discrimination measures. And now I'm going to provide an overview of what has been the EEOC's activity on employment discrimination protections for LGBT workers. Feel free to download the PowerPoint or to request it after the call. And for future follow-up questions we don't get to this afternoon, note that you can find my phone number and email address on the first slide first slide here. And as well, there are internet links on each slide to the relevant current EEOC resource materials for further information. Beginning on slide 2, before we turn to discussing LGBT-related job discrimination, a quick reminder that EEOC is a bipartisan federal government agency. We enforce the federal EEO laws. Private sector and state and local government applicants and employees can file complaints of job discrimination with us, and then we have the opportunity to mediate, investigate, and resolve those claims, and in some cases, we may pursue litigation. We also oversee EEO compliance by federal government agencies in their role as employers with respect to their own applicants and employees. And for all sectors of employment, we work to prevent discrimination before it occurs through outreach, education, and technical assistance. Turning to slide 3, EEOC enforced laws address race, color, religion, national origin, sex, pregnancy, age 40 or older, disability, genetic information, and retaliation. Now, of course, some state or local EEO laws have additional protections. As Janet mentioned, for example, more than 20 states and more than 250 cities or counties have their own laws that explicitly prohibit employment discrimination based on either sexual orientation, gender identity, or both. EEOC enforced laws, the federal EEO laws, apply to most employers with 15 or more employees. A few more details here on the slide. But remember, keep in mind that some state or local EEO laws cover even smaller companies than the federal EEO laws. Turning now to slide 4 and our specific topic for today of employment discrimination protections for LGBT workers, we're going to start with the scope of sex discrimination. Back in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a case called Pricewaterhouse versus Hopkins that the federal law prohibiting sex discrimination in employment, called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, covers job bias not just against a male in favor of a female or a female in favor of a male, but also applies to bias based on gender stereotypes. For example, discrimination because a woman does not dress or talk in a feminine manner, or because a man acts in an effeminate manner. While Title VII does not explicitly include gender identity or sexual orientation in its list of protected bases, the EEOC in recent years has applied this gender stereotyping as well as other legal theories to interpret Title VII's existing prohibition on sex discrimination to include discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. Some further observations about this on slide 5. The Commission has reasoned that applying Title VII to LGBT workers does not create new protected groups under Title VII, but rather simply recognizes the scope of the existing statutorily protected characteristic of sex. Some courts continue to hold that these claims are not covered by Title VII, while other courts are reconsidering older precedents that precluded LGBT-related sex discrimination claims. And on the bottom of slide 5, you'll find a link to a compilation of court decision summaries called Examples of Court Decisions Supporting Coverage of LGBT-Related Discrimination under Title VII. That's posted on EEOC.gov, and that will give you a good overview of the court decisions that are supportive of this interpretation of Title VII. On slide 6, we look at some examples of Title VII sex discrimination claims relating to gender identity. Failing to hire an applicant because she is a transgender woman, or firing an employee because he is planning to or has made a gender transition. Workplace harassment because of gender transition, for example, epithets or other harassing behavior, including intentional or persistent failure to use the new name and gender pronoun that correspond to the gender identity with which the employee identifies and has told management and coworkers about, or refusal to update personnel records as practicable. Another example is certain types of exclusions in employer-provided health insurance for medically necessary treatment that would otherwise be covered. On slide 7, you'll find more information about employment records. What documentation is an employee typically asked for by an employer in order to make a change to the name and gender listed in the employer's official personnel records? Employees and employers may be well familiar with handling name changes, but have raised questions about a change of the sex listed on employment records. The U.S. Social Security Administration has a current process for people seeking to obtain a legal change of sex on official federal government Social Security records so that an employer can then change payroll records. The link to the SSA information is here on slide 7. The SSA form, also linked here, provides several different documentation options that can be submitted to SSA, including obtaining a revised passport from the U.S. State Department reflecting the individual's new name and gender. Now on slide 8, let's look at some common examples of Title VII sex discrimination claims we've seen relating to sexual orientation. They include refusing to hire, denying promotion, or terminating an employee because of sexual orientation, supervisory or coworker harassment based on sexual orientation, for example, derogatory terms, sexually oriented comments, or disparaging remarks for associating with a person of the same or opposite sex, and discriminating in the terms, conditions, or privileges of employment based on sexual orientation. And again, each of the links here directs you to EEOC materials or cases that have involved these issues. Now, on slide 9, you'll find some examples of particular recent EEOC cases involving LGBT-related sex discrimination under Title VII. The first is the settlement of EEOC versus Deluxe Financial Services Corporation, which was a Minnesota case resolved in January 2016. According to the EEOC's lawsuit, the employee presented as male when hired by the company and performed duties satisfactorily throughout a lengthy tenure. But after she informed her supervisor she was transgender and began to present as a woman at work, the company allegedly subjected her to a hostile work environment based on sex in violation of Title VII. And you can read about the terms of the settlement in the press release link there on slide 9. The second example is a favorable court ruling in EEOC versus Scott Medical Health Center in November 2016, a case involving a gay male employee whom EEOC alleged was subjected to sex discrimination when he was harassed because of his sexual orientation and then forced to quit his job rather than endure further harassment. The court held in that case that sexual orientation discrimination is a form of sex discrimination under Title VII and denied the employer's motion to dismiss the lawsuit, allowing EEOC's case to go forward. In its decision, the court said, quote, "There is no more obvious form of sex stereotyping than making a determination that a person should conform to heterosexuality." The third example on slide 9 is an agreed resolution in October 2016 of an EEOC charge against Mon General Hospital. Here, the charge alleged that Title VII sex discrimination because the hospital offered its employees spousal medical benefits, but denied them to the charging party because she was married to a same-sex spouse. And EEOC found cause to believe that this type of policy, affording spousal medical benefits only to those with opposite-sex spouses, violated Title VII sex discrimination prohibition. On slide 10, a note about coworker and customer reactions. Sometimes employers or employees wonder if anti-LGBT sentiment on the part of coworkers or customers provides any statutory defense under Title VII to discrimination. It's noteworthy that EEOC ruled in a federal sector administrative decision in a Title VII transgender discrimination case that, quote, "Supervisory and coworker confusion or anxiety cannot justify discriminatory terms and conditions of employment. Title VII prohibits discrimination based on sex, whether motivated by hostility, by desire to protect people of a certain gender, by gender stereotypes, or by the desire to accommodate other people's prejudices or discomfort." On slide 11, a related observation about personal beliefs and anti-discrimination laws that may help explain this reasoning. The Commission has observed previously that, like all non-discrimination provisions, these protections address workplace conduct, not personal belief. In other words, these protections do not require any employee to change their beliefs. Rather, EEO protections seek to ensure appropriate workplace treatment so that all employees can perform their jobs free from discrimination. Turning to slide 12, we are also sometimes asked about whether it is a statutory defense under the federal law of Title VII if a state or local law says it's okay to discriminate, or even purports to require the discrimination at issue. Title VII has a provision in the law itself addressing this question, which the Commission has explained as follows. If a state or local law permits or does not prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, the EEOC will still enforce Title VII's discrimination prohibitions against covered employers in that jurisdiction because contrary state law is not a defense under Title VII. On slide 13, you'll find the link to a resource webpage entitled What You Should Know About EEOC and the Enforcement Protections for LGBT Workers for much more in-depth information about this topic and links to related publications. On slide 14, because we strive to provide whatever technical assistance might be useful for both employees and employers, to get you started, here are some useful links, if you haven't looked at them already, to some of the many publications for employers on our website. The Overview for Employers, the EEOC Small Business Resource Center page, and a compilation of frequently asked questions by employers. On slide 15, you'll find the information for employees or applicants about filing a charge or a complaint, whether they are private sector or state and local government employees, or the separate process for federal government applicants and employees. And finally, on slide 16, all the information for employers and employees about how to call EEOC or visit our website, eeoc.gov. And with that, Pat, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jean. And actually, we've got quite a few questions, so let me kind of put that first one to you a little bit about what do you anticipate changing with the new administration, or what are you seeing? People are worried about things about being able to still get your gender markers changed on your passports, and what else are you kind of hearing? And I know you don't have the crystal ball, but we figured give you a chance to answer that one.
Right. Well, with respect to the EEOC's interpretation of Title VII, that's been a frequent question about what may change, but as with any issue, we'll have to wait and see. It is interesting to note, if you look at the EEOC's compilation of court decisions linked back on slide 5, many, if not most, of those court cases were filed by private parties, not the government. That's also true of the 3 appellate court cases currently pending in the 2nd, 7th, and 11th circuits, raising the issue of whether sexual orientation discrimination is sex discrimination under Title VII, and the currently pending Supreme Court case raising the issue of whether gender identity discrimination is sex discrimination under Title IX. So cases raising these issues will presumably continue to percolate in the courts, whether filed by the government or filed by private parties. As I noted earlier, right now there is a patchwork of federal court decisions around the country on these questions, reaching different conclusions under Title VII. The government's interpretation of the law receives a level of deference by courts, but courts then have the job to rule in the cases presented to them, and the legal questions these cases raise about the scope of Title VII sex discrimination won't be considered resolved with finality until the Supreme Court rules on these issues, if and when it chooses to do so.
So lots to stand and watch and keep up on, so thank you for that. Let me jump back. Laura, I've got a question for you. Back on one of your slides, you mentioned the injunction for 1557, and Toby asked a question about in regards to transgender persons and how have they addressed the fears.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I can certainly understand the fears that are coming from the transgender community. I think it's a really good question because we know historically that transgender people have essentially been locked out of healthcare coverage. And we had done some research in addition to some of the work that I showed you, doing focus groups. And, trans people, it's not just about not even knowing that their coverage might not be there because of exclusions or other forms of discrimination, but that the very act of trying to engage with the insurance market, calling a company and being afraid of being misgendered, was a real deterrent for people. So that I can certainly empathize that the fear is real. I think one of the important things that advocates are doing is to try and communicate as best as we can that that this is the best time, that that a number of states, I think we're at 18 states and District of Columbia, have already taken steps to do things like remove exclusions for transition-related care in state plans. So there are state leaders leading the way, and companies themselves. We think of insurance companies sometimes as the bad guys in this, but there are actually a number that have taken steps on their own without any government prodding to be providing the type of care and coverage that people need. So I think it's important that we're communicating to the community what rights there are and what options there are, and also to make sure that we are doing a good job telling people stories, those folks who are able to share what it's like to be trans in America at this point, including around healthcare. I think that's one of the best ways that we can combat the fears, because if we can talk about the problem, we can actually find some solutions. So I'm hopeful that that lawsuit doesn't go anywhere. The judge shopped. This was a person that they knew would give them the ruling that they wanted, and so I'm hopeful that as it makes its way up the courts, we will not see the type of ruling that we saw on New Year's Eve. Thanks for your question.
Thanks, Laura. Janet, there was a question on one of your slides that you mentioned that you have about 75% support from heterosexual employees. How is that measured? Julie wanted to know how you got that number.
That's a good question. What Dow does on an annual basis is it's actually prepare and send out to all employees in the company a survey. And the survey changes from year to year, but our most recent survey did talk about the activities that we'd been doing, and enough. It was kind of a general question, but it was trying to aim to making sure that what we are doing is the right thing. And then the answer to that particular question was 75%. So we felt good about that. Now, as I mentioned, we are in rural areas and in very conservative states for the most part. So to have 75% being comfortable with the positioning that we're taking was hopeful for us, but obviously we'd like to see it even higher than that.
Great, sounds good. There was also a question about whether Dow was involved in the pigeon case in Texas.
Not directly. What we have been doing in Texas is being engaged on the legislation that was introduced just recently by the Lieutenant Governor. The Lieutenant Governor in Texas is equivalent to the head or the leader of the Senate in that state. And so with his introducing a very negative anti-LGBT bill, we've joined a coalition that was put together by a very staunch group for the business community. It's called Texas Association for Business, and it's TAB, and it's been very helpful to get the business community together against that bill. We don't know entirely what's going to happen there. We feel fairly comfortable that it won't make it all the way through. We have a pretty good governor as well, and so that's most of what we're focusing on at this point.
Great. And we can most of the questions that are left are kind of in general, so we kind of make this a little more discussion. But Lori asked a question about, we haven't seen much discussion about anti-adoption for LGBT couples. Is there any word or discussion you've heard on that?
I might defer to Laura on that, but I have not seen as much focus on that from an employer perspective. Although we've seen it because it doesn't directly impact our employee workplace environment as much as these other items do, we just haven't been as involved.
Yeah, and it's a good question, because that's often been a hotbed of rights, around parenting for LGBT people. Sort of the quick answer is I haven't heard of specific laws that go right at issues of adoption or foster care, other things like that. Except for some of the things that were mentioned already about some of these religious exemption laws. For example, in Michigan, now it is over a year and a half ago, Michigan passed a law that allowed for religious exemptions in foster care and adoption settings. And so that allows for social service agencies who receive money from the state government to do things like foster care placements and do adoption services. They're allowed to opt out of providing those services to same-sex couples. And so those are really the tricky things that we have to watch out for, because the law or the proposed legislation may not directly prohibit same-sex couples from, say, adopting a child or fostering a child. That's actually, most states actually have protections around adoption. Most are pretty silent on foster care. But we have to watch out for those exemption laws, because those types of things can undermine existing protections or prevent new ones from coming into place if they basically let people opt out because of misuse of religion.
Got it. Thanks. Jean, question for you. Somebody asked about if you witness discrimination from someone, can you report it even if you aren't the direct victim of that harassment?
You can and should report it within the company. You can certainly contact EEOC, and while we would, through the intake process, determine whether there was something that we could do to reach out to the affected employee, we would see whether there was something we can do to help. So all that contact information for reaching the EEOC field office, we have 53 offices throughout the country. To find the one in your jurisdiction, those links are on my second to last slide, and you can always contact us. But also, most importantly, first step is to raise the issue as a bystander witness within the company to management, so that they're aware of the harassment that occurred.
So speaking up. The other question that kind of came down is, how would you find out, or what's the process, the way you would get changes to Title VII in terms of interpretations or things like that? How does that process kind of work?
Do you mean within EEOC?
Right.
Well, the commission is comprised of 5 members, one of whom is designated by the president as a chair. All 5 members are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. We also have a general counsel who's nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. These 5 commissioners serve staggered terms, so they one's term expires each year. So currently we have 4 members. The president designated one of the current members yesterday as the new acting chair of the commission. As matters are presented to the commission for a vote by the chair, policy positions are taken. So the commission routinely votes on briefs or amicus briefs that it files in the appellate courts, or on certain federal sector administrative decisions, other matters, enforcement guidance. And so it's through voting on matters that are presented to the current commission that each commission takes its policy positions, makes its legal interpretations of Title VII as enforcement goes forward. So that's why, although this has been a frequent question about whether there will be changes, and if so, when or how, as with any issue, we will have to wait and see whether and how the commission acts in that regard.
Excellent, thanks. And we do have a lot of questions about the mechanics and how to do that, and what happens to insurance and transgender employees. And we're going to have to table those right now, and I'm going to ask our presenters if they could give us some blog answers to pass out after. But I do want to give them each just about 30 seconds to be able to do kind of closing comments. So, Laura, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Really great questions. I know that there were a lot more, so we're excited to share our thoughts with you after the call. I think my one comment to close would really just to stay engaged. There's a lot of information flying at us at all times, and I think it's really important that, particularly in the workplace context, we we make the business case, as Janet was talking about before. There's really good research evidence that having LGBT inclusive workplace policies is associated with better business outcomes, and businesses lead not just because it's good for the bottom line, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think being able to put forward that business case and show the real leadership of the business community has been a really strong tool for us. So I encourage folks to just stay engaged, tell your stories, and ask questions and get as much information as you can as we watch what happens over the next year and beyond. So thank you all very much.
Great. Janet?
Thank you. Probably what the big message I want to do is to let everyone know that Dow will stay engaged. And I encourage each of you who are in your various companies to also get engaged. One of the things that we found out with the North Carolina experience, and hopefully that we will find out with the Texas experience, is if we get the business community engaged, and businesses can get engaged in all kinds of ways. Some of them are going to be in a position to encourage perhaps sporting events not to take place in a particular state, or otherwise just provide leadership. We all have our ways of trying to put pressure on the various state governments or municipal governments that move in a direction that is so negative. This is an important time period. I don't think we should presuppose how anyone or any legislature or how the federal government might act, but if we're not diligent in watching it carefully, that's when we're going to be caught flat-footed. So I encourage everyone to watch carefully. If there's anything that I can do to help out, please reach out to me. I'm committed, and my company is committed to doing what we can do in this space. Thank you again.
Thanks, Janet. Jean?
Again, I'd like to underscore what Janet said, that you should feel free to contact us. The attorneys in my office, the Office of Legal Counsel at the EEOC headquarters, take calls from employers and employees every day. We can't bind the commission in any particular case, but we're more than happy to answer your legal questions by directing you to the relevant information and suggesting ways other employers have handled similar situations, and seeing if we can otherwise be of help. We also provide, as I mentioned at the outset, technical assistance, outreach, and training presentations. You can contact me about that, and I would encourage you to look at the many publications on this topic that we've issued from the link on slide 13, the What You Should Know publication about this topic. It'll lead you to all our resources on this issue. So please feel free to not only look at those, but also to contact us if we can be of help.
Thanks. And all three of you, amazing amount of work, not just on this call, but where you've come to with your organizations all the way through. So we thank you for that work, and thank everybody for the questions and joining us today. We hope we'll be able to continue these discussions and see many of you in Philadelphia for our summit this year. When you end the call today, you will get a short summary survey that will ask you about the call and ideas, and so please give us your feedback. Our next town call will be February 23rd. We'll be looking at LGBT generations. And again, any more questions on training, please contact me. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.